Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Andrew Schwartz at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green, joining you from Sydney, Australia, and joining us from Washington, D.C. I'm delighted we have Congressman Bera of the 6th District of California in the House of Representatives. He's the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and one of the most important voices in Congress on Asia, where he is the senior Democrat minority representative on the committee and a real force for clarity and American purpose. And in a time of partisanship, a real force for bipartisanship. We'll talk about that. Not easy, but very important. Thanks for joining us.
Mike, thanks for having me on. Glad to be here.
We always start with the how did you get here question. So maybe two short parts to that. What got you into public life, elected office, and what attracted you to the Asia portfolio in the House?
You know, wasn't exactly how I started out, right? So I'm a doctor by training, son of immigrants from India, was always politically engaged. And then, in 2007, this crazy senator from Illinois decided to run for president, Barack Obama, got involved in his campaign. He got elected, and I had this crazy notion of running for Congress. I'd never run for anything before. And my wife's like, how are you going to get elected? It's like, I don't know, but I'm going to run. Because I knew President Obama was going to work on healthcare. And in fact, he was working on the Affordable Care Act at that time. Ran in 2010, did not get elected, but got pretty close and then got elected in the 2012 election cycle. As a freshman, you can't get on the healthcare committees. So what I did know is I was the only Indian American member of Congress. And I would get more coverage in India than I would in the United States because they were thrilled at my election. Figured I'd get on foreign affairs, I'd get on the Asia Subcommittee and work on U.S.-India, U.S.-Asia writ large, and really was just fascinated with the region. The more folks I met, the more I read about it, the more I traveled, realized how I think this is the most pivotal region in the world at this point in the 21st century. So we've got to get Asia right. And then by the time I could get on the Ways and Means Committee, I could get a subcommittee gavel as chairman on Asia. So decided to stick with foreign affairs, and I think it was the right decision.
I assume you remember the India caucus on the Hill?
I am, and the last few days have been pretty busy.
I can imagine with the Kashmir tensions. I left the White House in 2006 and was asked by the Indian embassy to help with the launch of the India caucus, which was absolutely amazing. It went from nothing to being the second largest caucus after APAC. And I assume it's pretty active now.
It's still one of the largest caucuses, and I've been had the privilege of being the co-chair of the caucus in the past. Ro Khanna right now is the co-chair. And also just watched, when I first got elected in 2013, was the only Indian American member of Congress, and only the third in U.S. history. Fast forward to today, there's the Samosa caucus, as Raja Krishnamurthy calls this, is 5 large. So
that's amazing. The Samosa caucus?
That's what Raja has termed us. So
your district, the 6th District of California, I'm from Maryland, so I don't really know California geography, and maybe a lot of our listeners don't. Where is that?
My district is all within Sacramento County, and I have half the city of Sacramento. Sacramento's the capital of the state of California, and I'm proud to say California now is the 4th largest economy in the world, having just surpassed Japan.
Amazing. So I want to get back to the India-Pakistan problem, tariffs, and a few other policy issues, but maybe you can give us your view. What's at stake for the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific? What do you think the U.S. should be prioritizing? And I'll ask you in a minute what you think we're getting right and wrong right now.
I mean, we should be prioritizing everything right now. And I think President Trump would take it as a compliment. He's been a bit disruptive. But I do think, as I think about what he's doing writ large in foreign affairs, I think some of what he's doing, and I was in Europe a couple of weeks ago, talking to the Europeans, I think there's a genuine desire to bring the conflict in Ukraine to some sort of conclusion. I think that is genuine from President Trump. I also think there's a recognition when he says Europe's got to step up on European security. Part of that is we've got to pivot our focus to the Indo-Pacific, right? If you look at around tariffs, the countries that he's prioritized trade deals with, Korea, Japan, India, Vietnam, those are all pivotal Indo-Pacific countries. I'm glad that there's a pause in the tariffs with China. We'll see where that evolves and what that negotiation looks like. And I think there's a recognition that we've got to get the Indo-Pacific right. Now, I applaud the Biden administration. I think they did some pretty good things in terms of getting the Japan-Korea relationship to a much better place, codifying some things in the U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral, super important. I think AUKUS is a very important deal, the submarine deal between the United States, Australia, and the UK. And that I was in Australia a month or two ago and, evaluating Pier 1 of AUKUS. That's moving forward, I think, in a good way. The fact that the Philippines have come back into the U.S. sphere of influence and, you're seeing more regular troop rotations through the Philippines and a presence there. I think that helps hopefully stabilize the South China Sea, which clearly is a hotspot. What we're getting wrong right now, I think, with the Trump administration, I do think the shutting of USAID and some of our aid and development tools, particularly in the Pacific Islands, is going to be a setback for us. And again, we're talking to Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the Brits, and others to perhaps step up their game in the Pacific Islands until we return with full force.
So can you give listeners a sense of how you, as the ranking member of the subcommittee and a member of Congress, and how Congress more generally shapes the approach to all these things? Like on AUKUS, obviously you had to pass ITAR reform and legislation enabling the Virginia-class submarines to be sold under Pillar 1. But what are some of the ways that you're weighing in on these issues you mentioned?
Yeah, some of it's legislatively. A lot of foreign affairs is relationship building. And I learned a lot from my prior chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Ed Royce, a Republican that traveled a lot, built up relationships over the years, knew most of the world leaders. So I'll use a small example. A few weeks ago, I was in Korea. Obviously, Korean politics are very interesting these days with the martial law declaration, post-declaration, then the impeachment of President Yoon, that being upheld by the Supreme Court in Korea. And I'd say Korean democracy held and worked the way it was supposed to. But now you have an election taking place in Korea. So part of this was to go visit with the Speaker of the National Assembly, who will still be there, and some of the parliamentarians to reiterate the U.S. commitment to Korea. There is a movement inside Korea about some concern about the U.S. commitments. 60% of the Korean population supports pursuing their own nuclear technology. And again, I think that would be a bad idea. We have the Washington Declaration, which, they're a treaty ally. We should be the ones providing the nuclear deterrence. So some of it is going there, reassuring them that Congress, Democrats and Republicans, so I led a bipartisan delegation, continue to support the treaty, and we are not going anywhere. We are there with the Koreans. I think that's a real important message. Because if Korea was to pursue nuclear technology, Japan probably follows suit fairly quickly. And that's going to be destabilizing to the Chinese. They'll see that as a real threat. And the goal here is to avoid war in East Asia, avoid war in the Indo-Pacific. So it's things like that. And I think that's, even in the minority, going out there, talking to folks. We interact with Australian Ambassador Kevin Rudd on a regular basis, to make sure freshman members of Congress understand why AUKUS is such a valuable piece of our foreign policy strategy. It's good for America. It addresses President Trump's concerns about wanting to build more American stuff. And Australia is very, it is bringing in funding from Australia. So it checks all the boxes. So different things like that.
Let me pick up on some of those. On Korea, I don't know if you saw it just overnight your time. There's a new poll in Korea that shows over 80% now support nuclear weapons. Now, a lot of that is, in my view, cavalier. It's aspirational. It's not the actual complexities and risks to Korea are monumental, but it's an indication that some allies are worried about us. There was a poll in Australia, but probably about the time you were here, from the Lowy Institute. Only 36% of Australians trust the U.S. right now. In Japan, the number's about 26%. Do you feel like you're able to move the dial or with the public, or is it sort of more counterparts in parliaments or government, or how do you measure success?
So it's really reassuring the government folks, right? Because I don't have the same bully pulpit that President Trump has. But in Korea, I do have a pretty big following. So we're able to then do press and talk to the press in Korea, do the same in India and other places where I can actually be able to weigh in on the congressional perspective. Most of this is nonpartisan, right? So in the first Trump term, we were able to introduce an advanced legislation to say the president couldn't go below certain troop numbers in Korea without coming to Congress. And we did actually get that passed into law. So we'll do things like that again. When it comes to Korea, Japan, Indo-Pacific security, the potential threat from China, those tend to be nonpartisan issues. So if we're speaking as Democrats and Republicans and are on bipartisan codels, I think the elected leaders do hear what we're saying.
Yeah, I often tell people, and now's your opportunity to tell me if I'm wrong, but I often tell people in the region that Asia policy and especially commitment to our allies is one of the most bipartisan issues in the U.S. right now. I hope that's right.
I think that is correct. So
yeah. Phew, good. I got a couple dozen speeches and articles saying that. So now I have a footnote. And thanks in no small part to what you and Congressman Royce before you and others have done. On Korea, is part of the congressional job keeping the administration focused on things they don't want to focus on? The North Korea problem, which I worked on in the Bush administration, it kind of veers between what Kurt Campbell calls the cult of the negotiator, where the entire world media is watching the negotiations. It goes from that to crickets chirping and nobody paying attention. Are you worried about North Korea? Are you able to keep focus? Because it's not been part of the administration's narrative thus far this time.
Yeah, I mean, we pay attention to North Korea. We pay attention to North Korea, Russia. What's that relationship like right now? My opinion only, I think it's a transactional relationship right now because Russia does need, some of the artillery and other things that North Korea can provide. Post the Ukraine conflict, is that a long-term relationship or does that relationship fray? I do worry about some of the silence out of North Korea, that they're probably watching South Korean politics and saying, hey, we don't need to do anything right now. South Korea's got its own internal challenges and let's just pay attention and watch. But we have expected more in the way of missile tests and so forth. I think we are trying to figure out, okay, what is North Korea getting in return for supporting the Russians? Are they getting missile technology, et cetera? And what is that technology? Obviously, it's hard to get intelligence out of North Korea. We have heard some of the overtures where Trump has said he's open to another dialogue. And, again, I know the Biden administration was open to dialogue, but there was never a response from Kim Jong-un. So it's still there. It's lurking in the shadows. We have to pay attention to it. Obviously, the South Koreans pay attention to it. And then the one variable is, the opposition party will probably win the presidential elections in Korea. Does it go back to where the prior administration, the Moon administration was, which really was probably made more overtures to North Korea and frayed some of the relationship between Korea and Japan? Part of the reason that we were there is also to really emphasize keeping the Japan-Korea relationship at a good place right now, because it is in a much better place than it was 5 years ago, as well as the trilateral relationship between the U.S., Japan, and Korea in a good place. And we did get those assurances. So we've also been talking to the Japanese, but we'll have to see. So immediately after the presidential election, I would hope there's some delegations that are traveling there, or I would hope that the next Korean president comes to the United States fairly quickly.
That is an area where Congress definitely can help, because most of the explosions in Korea-Japan relations come from the National Assembly or the Japanese Diet. It's almost never the government. It's almost always the elected representatives of the Korean and Japanese people, and some attention to that on a bipartisan basis, in my experience, goes a long, long way.
Yeah, no, and we're trying to also codify an annual trilateral between the legislators. So between a handful of members of Congress, House, Senate, a handful of members of the National Assembly, a handful of members of the Diet, similar to what they did at Camp David, but do it in the legislative branch, because presidents are here for 4 or 8 years. In Korea, they're there for 5 years. But this is my 13th year in Congress, and that's where we can build deep relationships. So now I've got a relationship with the current speaker in the National Assembly. Obviously, we meet with the leadership in the Diet, and I do think the legislative branch has a real role here.
You mentioned earlier amendments, I think it was to the National Defense Authorization Act, saying the president can't withdraw troops from Korea. I think there's also a clause on NATO without congressional approval. I was in Washington at the time, and my recollection was that came up before the president's 2018 visit with Kim Jong-un, where he did say, surprising his own Pentagon, I'd like to pull troops out of Korea someday. And it was pretty clear there wasn't support among Republicans or Democrats. So 2 things make this a little more dangerous this time, I think, and our mutual friend Victor Cha is quite worried about this. One is that it seems the president is willing to defy Congress on budget issues more. Maybe you can speak to that. And the second thing is we have a much more desperate challenge with China. The order of battle is not favorable. And so a lot of people who may not care at all about diplomacy with North Korea or politics in the Pentagon are worried about how we get forces into the contest with China and look at the Korean Peninsula and see, heavy armored and mechanized artillery units that aren't so helpful. So there's kind of a almost logical military planning pressure on the U.S. presence in Korea, plus the president's own sort of history on the issue and more recent, I don't know what verb to use, defiance, disinterest, ambivalence about Article 1 of the Constitution. What's your take?
Well, so again, I would say let's update and refresh our foreign policy, national security posture in the region to meet today's challenges. So, much of our presence on the Korean Peninsula is focused on North Korea. Now, we should continue to focus on North Korea, but we should also then think about, okay, if there is a conflict or confrontation with China, what is the Korean role there, right? What does that look like? I think we're pretty clear with where Japan would be, given their history, but we want to avoid that confrontation. We know Japan's working fairly quickly to increase its defense spending. We know that there's a burgeoning defense production line capacity in Korea, and their defense industry is maturing. So what does that look like in the event of a confrontation? And then here's something that actually is a win-win that you hear President Trump talk a lot about, that we have trouble building ships in America, right? So this is a place where both Korea and Japan are much better at building ships than we are. So certainly ship repair is something that they ought to be able to do. But we've seen, when I was out there, I visited the Hanwha Shipworks, and they bought the Philadelphia shipyards. They want to expand and help us build ships. That meets the president's goal of getting foreign investment to come into the United States, but create U.S. jobs. We need that help. President does want to build more ships because he created an Office of Shipbuilding. So that also might be an area where we work with the Japanese and Koreans. And we've had those conversations, again, to invest in America to help us rebuild a shipbuilding industry.
Is the 6th District landlocked?
We're a confluence of two rivers, but yeah, it's not a Sacramento-specific thing, but that's my role as a member of Congress and a senior member on the Foreign Affairs Committee, that we got to protect our national security. And here's a win-win that's good for Korea, good for Japan, good for the United States.
One of maybe the most important members of Congress to build up the U.S. Navy 100 years ago was Carl Vinson, who came from a landlocked district in Georgia. So it's a proud tradition of maritime strategy coming from landlocked congressional districts. And, let's face it, California is pretty close to Asia. What's the mood on AUKUS? I mean, every time I go back to D.C. and talk to members, it's got quite broad bipartisan support. Nervousness about the U.S. submarine building capacity, but pretty broad support. There's a lot more nervousness in Australia, as you'd expect. But what's your take?
I think there's still broad support amongst the members that are on the Armed Services Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee. We're the ones that probably pay the closest attention to AUKUS. So now we have a large freshman class. We've got to educate them and get them to understand why this is a good deal for all three parties. Pillar 1, that was part of the reason to travel to Australia, to get a sense of how it's going. It's going fairly well. And now can we move this along? So again, I'm hearing all the right things out of the Trump administration when it comes to AUKUS. I think House and Senate are fully supportive. It meets a lot of the president's own goals. It is Australia buying things from the United States. That president clearly wants that. And again, I'm pretty positive, but President Trump surprises at times as well.
Speaking of which, woke up this morning here in Australia to see that we had radically cut tariffs on China, and they'd radically cut tariffs on us. It's a good outcome. It makes you wonder whether the whole, uncertainty and chaos in the markets was worth it. When I visited you back in early April in your office, I was really almost inspired but confused because a lot of members on their doors had posters that said tariffs cost American jobs with a Canadian flag, and it was all Democratic members. And when I came up in this political and policy world, it was the Republicans who were the free traders. So the whole, as you said, the whole tariff policy of the president, I think he likes being unpredictable on this. It's not great for markets and businesses, which like certainty. But what's your sense of the temperature in Congress about the tariffs and with respect to our allies in Asia?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of unease with President Trump's approach to tariffs amongst both Democrats and Republicans. Certainly, farm state Republicans are very worried about this, and you've seen some of them start to speak out. Traditional Republican orthodoxy would be to break down trade barriers, not enact trade barriers. But you do see the parties shifting a bit. So I was very pro-TPP, really feel like we made a mistake not getting that across the finish line. But we are where we are. If we can use these trade negotiations to reduce barriers, I don't know if we get to zero tariffs, as Vietnam has said, they're willing to do. But the other thing, we do export a lot of services that don't quite get counted on the trade surplus or trade deficits. So, how do we factor that in here? I do think, as you alluded to the sign, I do think it impacts American jobs, but I really think it impacts American consumers' prices, what they're paying for, because I am a believer that the tariffs are ultimately paid for by the consumer.
It made the news when Senator Warner went after Jameson Greer, the U.S. trade rep, for putting tariffs on Australia, one of our closest, arguably our closest ally. And it went a bit viral, not just in Australia, but everywhere. Is that part of the discussion? I suspect most members are looking at their exports and the consumer inflation impact. But are you finding that the strategic dimension of all this is part of the discussion in the Hill?
Yeah, and we don't have a trade deficit with Australia. In fact, we have a trade surplus with Australia. So, and we shouldn't be picking fights with our friends, which is why I think you saw a lot of pushback on why are we going after Canada and Mexico? Our production lines are so intertwined with both those countries. And you've got a vehicle in USMCA that's going to come up for renegotiation. So that would be the vehicle by which to address any challenges that you see or modernize it. Again, that's not the president's style. There is a lot of back and forth in this whipsawing. We'll see where this lands. But ultimately, I'm glad that there are negotiations going on with China. I'm glad that there are conversations with Japan, Korea, India, Vietnam. I think the ASEAN nations I've met with most of the ASEAN ambassadors, and I'm trying to talk them through here, saying don't do anything irrational, sit still for a bit and let's see how this plays out, but be ready to negotiate and look for the win-wins. So I was in Europe and Ireland, and the Irish don't really spend much on defense. They would say they're a neutral country. But what I would say is President Trump's probably not going to buy that argument. But you could approach them. Most of the important underwater cables that connect Europe to the United States run through your exclusive economic zone. You have to have maritime domain awareness. So why don't you go to President Trump and say, hey, help us build a Coast Guard, help us build a Navy so we can monitor our own territory. That technically is defense spending, but you need to do it anyway. So look for the win-wins.
It's a good point. I mean, people will have very strong views on Donald Trump. There's almost nobody who doesn't have a view maybe in mankind, everyone has a view. But one thing I think you're pointing to is some things needed to be fixed. Defense spending, international relations. I mean, there's some things needed to be fixed. And it's a good start for allies to think about how to help fix things and not just swing back. They may have to swing back. Countries may have to put tariffs back on the U.S. They have their own national interests, but it's not like we were in a completely sustainable trajectory on a lot of these issues, I think.
I would separate MAGA from America First. And I think there are a lot of folks that look at America First from the Democratic and Republican side, right? I think there are a lot of folks in America saying, hey, my life's not getting any better. It's harder for me to put food on the table. My kids are in their 30s and they can't afford to buy a house. And I want my government to focus on my life and not get involved in all these other wars and other things. Now, I think it's important for America to stay engaged with the rest of the world because there are still things that only we can do. We touched on, like Japan and Korea shouldn't have to worry about nuclear deterrence. That should be something that we do. Our intelligence capabilities are probably surpass most others. So with our friends and allies, that's something we can bring to the table. Korea and Japan are better at shipbuilding, so maybe they step up their game there. And again, I don't know exactly what the security architecture looks like, but it is going to be different than what we had in the 75 years post-World War II.
The polls we do at my center here and polls I've done at CSIS or that the Chicago Council does all have a pretty consistent pattern, which is Americans, by a pretty wide margin, support our alliances and by wide margins want our allies to do more. A lot of the allies are, but some really aren't. So maybe out of this will come this new architecture. I want to ask, can you go back to the budget a little bit? You mentioned earlier the thing that worries you is almost completely zeroing out development assistance, especially you said in the Pacific Islands. There's a lot of other instruments of American soft power or American positive influence that are also being cut. Radio Free Asia, I'm on the board, to be clear, but Radio Free Asia, the National Endowment for Democracy, a lot of congressionally funded tools of American engagement are being tossed out the window right now, or at least are in doubt. What's the mood on the Hill? I know there's so much going on that this probably is not the highest priority for members who are looking at inflation and other things. But is there a sense, maybe just in the Democratic caucus, that something has to be done to preserve or at least be able to rebuild some of these tools? Because the administration is actually turning up hard power in the Indo-Pacific. And not the president's budget, but the congressional budget, and certainly what the Pentagon has said. And you mentioned some specific examples. So on the hard power side, there's an urgency and it feels like there's some motion. But you can't keep the peace by just having a big club in your closet. You've got to reinforce the periphery, as you know. So what's the discussion like? What do you think the Hill can do? Arms are tied. What do you think?
So 100%. I mean, we're going to fight this fight. The things that we've authorized, funds that we've appropriated for these programs like USAID for Radio Free Asia, we're going to fight those cuts. We'll see how that all plays out. We are also going to make the case that getting rid of those programs that don't cost a whole lot actually hurt us in the long run. Programs, when I meet with the Pacific Island ambassadors, they always talk about the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps is one of the best diplomatic tools that we have, sending our young people out, but it's also good for our young people to get exposed to the world as well. I think we've got to try to fix immigration because we should want the best and the brightest from around the world to come get educated at U.S. universities, get to know the American people. Again, I travel a lot and I go to lots of these countries, meet with the leaders in foreign countries. Many of them got their education in the United States. That's a good thing for us. That is just smart diplomatic policy. So I worry about programs like that. And then programs like USAID, some of the global health security stuff that we were doing that President Trump has shut down. We're going to try to build that back. Maybe we'll build it back slightly differently, but I don't think we should evacuate the stage. I think we should do it with our allies and friends.
Do you talk about this with your constituents much? Like I said, there's so much going on for them to follow, but does this ever register with them?
I do. I mean, Right now, a lot of the folks that are showing up at my town halls and are yelling at me saying, do more, do more. What are you doing? Like, you need to have town halls like AOC. And it's like, well, I could go to Iowa and have a town hall. 5 people are going to show up because I'm not AOC. But I don't want World War III to start in Asia. So I can travel there. I can meet with these world leaders. I can try to reassure our allies and try to keep an architecture of alliance in place. That might be my role in Congress. So we've all got our specific niche areas. And again, that's one area that I am working hard on.
Speaking of World War III, maybe we can wrap up by turning to the India-Pakistan conflict. It's fast evolving, and we try not to do 4 hours news cycles on the podcast. But what's your take on where we're heading?
Yeah, so I'm happy that there's a ceasefire. And again, how I've approached this is, one, I think America does need to be engaged in this. And I was a little bit concerned about what Vice President Vance said. It's like, well, it's really their issue. And now I think we've still got to be a player here, a convener, a mediator. I'm glad that we were somewhat involved. We'll find out, how much Secretary Rubio was doing. My role, it's easy for me to get coverage in India. So, how do I get on Indian television, get in their press, and speak directly to the Indian people from a congressional perspective of how we were thinking about this? I'm glad there's a ceasefire. It's India and Pakistan, so that's always tenuous. But it's not really in Pakistan's interest right now to have a broader war. Wars are expensive. Their economy is not in a great place right now. And they have their own domestic terror threats that are really pretty bad. And it's not in India's interest really to have a war right now. They're in a trade negotiation with us. They're a country and economy on the rise. They're perfectly suited as we build redundant supply chains to move things to India. So there's a lot on India's plate as well. And it's in everyone's interest to try to take this temporary ceasefire into something longer. And then, I'd love for the Americans to play the lead role, but it might be the Arabian countries, right? Saudi Arabia, the Emirates. They may have lines of communication that are slightly different than what we have or what the Trump administration has.
It's just one more example of how, as Madeleine Albright said, the U.S., despite our various interesting political challenges, the U.S. is the indispensable country. It may in the end be a Gulf state that mediates, but the weight of the U.S. in international affairs is just too huge. We're still a quarter of global GDP. That's what we were in the 90s when people talked about unipolarity and American dominance. It's a more complicated world, that's for sure. But the fact that you're weighing in all these areas, Congressman, is great for your constituents in the country. And I think a lot of your counterparts in the region appreciate it. Thanks for spending the time with us today. Really, really good discussion.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. Be safe, be kind, and let's be well.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.